Hello, good evening. Good evening, everyone. This is Peter Heat. I'm glad to see everyone. Here we are, criminal law and procedure. So, this class is actually Wednesday, September 13th, and I'm just very, very glad to see everybody. I'm excited, as always, to discuss criminal law and procedure because there's always something happening in the criminal law. This is our early class. This is our third, I think, and we started to touch on some of the basic principles of criminal law, and we're going to go over those again today. We're going to talk and review our discussion about classification of crimes, about how we delineate crimes into most serious, medium serious, and low in seriousness, and how those crimes are handled in the criminal justice system, both in terms of how they're tried from procedure point of view and then what the potential penalties are from a seriousness point of view. And of course, as we've discussed in New Hampshire and in all New England states and in really most of our states, as well as the federal system, there's always a range of sentencing where there is discretion for the judge. There are certain very rare crimes for which there is what we call mandatory sentences, which are usually an established mandatory minimum. A judge still has discretion over the longer range of the potential sentences. Now, what happens when a prosecutor is faced with a mandatory minimum that he doesn't think is or she doesn't think is justified by the facts? What the prosecutor will do is try to come up with a different charge, still appropriate, but maybe in a different type range of charges that allows more discretion for sentencing. That's called charge bargaining. We'll talk about that later. So again, welcome to criminal law and procedure. I hope you're enjoying class as much as I'm enjoyed having you. I trust you've all been able to obtain your text, or again, you can go online. As you know, the first day uh, process is down at the bottom of Canvas, and you can get your text that way as well. Uh, so far, all you've had to do is get through all of chapter one for today. For the next class, we'll be moving on to reading chapter two. But tonight, I want to review a little of the things we discussed about, talk about classification of crimes, and again, talk about some of our fundamental principles, as well as give you an overview of the overall procedure in criminal procedure. In other words, an overview shot of how we get from the beginning of the criminal justice system when we create a crime or define a crime to a crime being committed to it being investigated and arrested and the triggering of the process as we move forward all the way to potential conviction, an appeal, and potential sentencing, how we get from A to B and why it takes so long. As we've talked about in Hampshire and in any place in the United States, under our Constitution, you have a right, the defendant has a right to a speedy trial. And what that really means is fairly relative because most of what happens in the criminal justice system in reality is not speedy. Now, another thing we'll talk about, if you remember, we took a look at the way the media portrays criminal justice system last uh, class when we looked at a portion of that classic old movie And Justice for All and that crazy opening scene with the prosecutor laying out their case very briefly, and then Al Pacino with his opening and everybody going crazy by the end. Uh, I'll be talking a little bit about that and sort of focusing on some issues. I want you to give that some more thought as to some of the things you would think are really not realistic, which is, of course, much of that. But again, it it highlights how the media often treats the criminal justice system and why there's so much misinformation about how the criminal justice system really functions. Uh, and unfortunately, and that is unfortunate because again, our criminal justice system, as you know, relies in terms of our juries on real citizens with no specific training having a major part to play in the criminal justice system. And not only for regular, what we call petit or trial juries, but also for what's known as the grand jury. Tonight, we'll talk about a little how that works and where that process fits in. We've heard a lot about the grand jury, for instance, in Georgia recently, that has returned the indictments against the former president and many of the people in his organization. We've actually heard about how they made certain recommendations, which is unusual because grand juries, the process is supposed to be secret until they actually decide to charge. We'll talk about that a little bit tonight and how that fits into the procedure as we look at it as a whole. Uh, One of the things I'd like to talk about to give you a little more background into how things work in New England and how some of the most serious crimes uh, are processed and how things happen is give you a little more insight into how it was that I began my career in law and what really brought me to this area. Because as we've discussed, New Hampshire, we're very fortunate, has one of the lower crime rates in the country. And we also have one of the lower homicide rates in the country. We are unique in that we prosecute all of our homicides out of one central office, which in New Hampshire is the Attorney General's office. Most states, the prosecutions for homicides and other serious felonies are handled by the various district attorneys who are, as I've discussed, elected, and one of the few officials in the criminal justice system that is elected because of the discretion and the importance of the prosecutor's role in the criminal justice system. In New Hampshire, again, we've had so few homicides that since early 1800s, it was decided that the Attorney General's office should handle all the prosecutions in New Hampshire. And we've never gotten to a point where the prosecutions or the number of homicides have been so great that they've thought about changing that. So the way it still stands today is that there was a homicide in Cheshire County or any county, it it is handled by the Attorney General's office and Assistant Attorney General in the criminal division. They come to the scene, they assist the police in the investigation. And again, a prosecutor's role is primarily to provide legal advice to the investigators as they move forward, particularly helping with evidence questions. Prosecutors don't get out there on the crime scene as you might see on TV in terms of hunting for evidence or so forth. What they do is get to a scene in terms of assisting at the command post, maybe assisting police with search warrant drafting. The prosecutors are much more familiar with the updates in the law of that particular jurisdiction and can help the police basically do it correctly, obtain the evidence in a correct fashion so the evidence hopefully does not get suppressed later before trial. Many cases are lost because the police, who are often well-meaning and hardworking, do not have enough training or make mistakes in the stress of the investigation that evidence, whether it's a confession or statement or physical evidence like a firearm or a weapon, blood, DNA, etc., can get suppressed if they don't collect the evidence right. Again, we are one of the few countries that uh, suppresses evidence when it isn't obtained correctly. In many countries, if police make a mistake in the obtaining the evidence, the police are disciplined, but the evidence still comes into court in our country because of the exclusionary rule, which we will talk about in greater detail in many weeks to come. The evidence is suppressed if it is found to be obtained illegally. And again, we're one of the few countries that does it. The police can be disciplined too if they make mistakes along the way, and it's found that it's because of incompetence or because whatever. Uh, but in the most serious result of that is that the evidence does not come in. Uh, One of the ways I learned about this early on was when I first became a prosecutor with the criminal justice division at the Attorney General's office. And this came about because at that time I was in law school. It was the early 1970s. I hate to say so far back. I was at Cornell Law School over in Ithaca, New York. And when I got to law school, I did not know, as many people don't who go to law school, what type of law they're really interested in, uh, what direction they would like to go. And many people change over the course of their career as well. I was mostly interested in trial law, And that really led me quickly to the conclusion that criminal law was the best way to get into court, either from the prosecution or the defense standpoint, and also into appellate work. At that time, again, in the 70s, no internet. And I found out about the job at the Attorney General's office by going on a bulletin board in the law school. Remember, do you ever remember bulletin boards when you were younger? And where people had notes up on in the hallway, and it was an indication that the Attorney General's office in New Hampshire had an opening in their criminal justice division. At that point, I knew I was interested in prosecution, and I'd interviewed with a number of large prosecution's offices, such as the Manhattan DA's office, the Brooklyn DA's office. I interviewed in the Philadelphia DA's office because I had come from outside Philadelphia at the time. But I was intrigued by the New Hampshire Attorney General's office having a criminal division. The reality is most attorney generals don't handle much criminal work. If you're in New York or a larger state like Pennsylvania, New Jersey, the Attorney General's office is more an advisor to state agencies and handles mostly state law, civil law issues. They do some, obviously, criminal prosecutions, usually when it involves large things such as environmental cases and Medicare fraud, things of that nature. But it's very unusual for an attorney general's office to be involved in the nitty gritty of the criminal courtroom, particularly when it comes to homicides, etc. But in New Hampshire, again, we're one of the very smallest states with sometimes the fewest homicides. Again, we average uh, in the last 15 to 20 years, it's been averaging, say, 15 to 25 in there. Normally, 18 to 23 would be a normal range. It's as strange as it seems, it always seems to come out about that. Last year, I think there was 17 or 18 homicides in the whole state for the entire year, and which is very, very low in some large cities. For instance, Chicago, which has the last few years been hit with a rampant number of homicides. There was over 300 in Chicago just alone last year. So that's close to one a day. Um, so again, New Hampshire and much of New England, we're very fortunate to have a lower homicide rate. At any rate, I was intrigued by this, and I remember deciding to respond and driving to an interview up in Concord. That's where our Attorney General's office is. And I came across from Ithaca, New York. So I remember driving. I hadn't been to central New Hampshire ever, especially coming from upstate New York. And if many of you have driven that way, you may know, well, you can go south and do the Mass Pike. And I said, oh, no, no, no. I want to see the scenery. So I come over through Albany and Troy and come over through southern Vermont and up over Hogback and down into Brattleboro. Oh my gosh! And I think it was January of 1975. And I was going to be graduating a few months later, and it was snowing, of course. And I'm coming down uh, Route 9 and 7 into Brattleboro, and then came across the river. And I came to this small town in the evening called Keene. Excuse me, I'd never known Keene before. And by the way, and this is 1975, and they hadn't finished the bypass in Keene, 101, 12, 10, and 9, and so forth. They were still building a lot of that. So I ended up coming down the hill, just like you do now, from Brattleboro, and only there was no way really around Keene. You had to turn left onto Main Street, right? Of course, what was I going to go by? Keene State College, which I had no idea was there. It was a beautiful evening. It was snowing, and I remember the wide Main Street that you all are familiar with in Keene State. And it was a beautiful evening, light snow, and way up at the head of the street there was this beautiful white church all lit up. And I just remember remarking or thinking to myself what a great town Keene would be. Many of you may have had that feeling when you first came to Keene. It's terrific. We're very, very lucky. We have a terrific town. The Keene State College campus is beautiful. It was even back then, and of course, it's undergone tremendous development since that time. Uh, anyway, it was just extraordinarily beautiful, and I kept going and had to take it slow because of the snow. I ended up in downtown Concord, staying in a hotel that's not even there, right along the highway. And the next morning, I went in for my interview as a somebody interested in criminal law. I didn't really understand what I was getting into, but I knew I wanted to be in court. And again, being in the prosecutor's office or the defense attorney was the fastest way. And again, in the 70s, the public defender system was just beginning. Uh, and they didn't have a large number of attorneys at that time. So it was just being developed. So, from a defense standpoint, you either had to get in a private firm generally or go into prosecution if you wanted to be in criminal law. So I thought, again, prosecution would be the way to go. I remember getting to the Capitol right in Concord, and I had to go to a building right next door called the State House Annex, a gray, very bland looking governmental building. I had to go to the second floor because at that time the Attorney General's office was so small, we were only in one part of one floor. And I went to interview, and the Attorney General at that time, they ushered me in after waiting and I had an interview with two folks. The Attorney General was soon to be Senator at that time, Attorney General Warren Rudman. You may have heard the term Rudman. Rudman became U.S. Senator for New Hampshire. Became very well known. As a terrific guy. And his second in command at that point, the Deputy Attorney General, was an attorney named David Souter. Souter, and you may recognize that name because Attorney Souter not only became my boss and a really good friend, but he's just a brilliant attorney. Went on the bench eventually in New Hampshire and then got appointed to the United States Supreme Court, one of the 9 justices on the United States Supreme Court. And New Hampshire has only had 2 attorneys ever in the history of our state to make it to the New Hampshire, U.S. Supreme Court in Washington. And David Souter was one of those. I didn't know that at the time. Of course, this is back in 1975, but I just remember the interview because Warren Rubin was more like a enthusiastic coach. He was in there talking about doing what's right and enforcing the law and holding the criminals accountable and so forth. And David Souter was much more intellectual, erudite sort of guy, and kept talking about the law, Mister Heed, the law. He wanted to know about my opinions on Plato and uh, my theories of republicanism in terms of the republic and in terms of liberalism and in terms of all sorts of philosophers in England and Italy. Anyway, he's fascinating. I only knew about like half of what he was talking about. I didn't want to appear uneducated, but David was a fabulous guy. And somehow I did okay because I got the job. And I ended up, after graduating law school, I got the employment. And remember, folks, as we might have mentioned, to be an attorney, you go to law school. And that's usually 3 years of law school after college. And once you graduate from law school, uh, you're really just beginning. It's not over yet. You have to decide what area you're going to work in because every state has its own, what we call it, right, bar exam, which we're going to talk about, originating from the old common law concept of passing the bar. And we're not talking about a place you drink alcohol. We're talking about the bar in court. Every court to this day, New Hampshire and throughout New England, they have a bar. And now you may think of it as a railing or a fence, but it's a division between the public and where the attorneys and their clients and judges and court personnel sit. That's called beyond the bar. And if you want to be an attorney, you have to pass the bar exam, which you think after 3 years of law school prepare you for this, but it really doesn't. Almost everyone, in order to pass the rigorous bar of each state, which varies from state to state, requires you to then take another course for several months during that summer, which I did. I remember moving to Concord, And immediately, I actually started as an intern, and most people do wherever you work. However, your work there and wherever you're hired on the condition that you're going to pass the bar, which usually takes place end of August or early September, just when most students are starting school. And then you have to wait a month or two until they grade all these exams. The exams themselves, very rigorous, much like an SAT. They take usually 2 days, two full 8-hour days with breaks. And one part of a bar examination is normally called the multi-state or interstate part, and it's multiple choice, very much like a SAT exam. And the second day is almost all essay about various factual scenarios, and you're asked to name the various issues you see and what are the legal issues that are going to be encountered and what are the various arguments on either side of a legal issue. That's one of the things you have to learn to do as an attorney, argue on both sides and find out what argument you think is the strongest, and then come down on one side or the other as to what you would think is going to prevail in that particular case. And you had to learn the particular law of each state, and that's all sorts of law. Even though I was interested in the criminal law and being a criminal law attorney, uh, to pass the bar, you have to know everything about all different types of law, including contract law, real estate law, corporate law, business law, secured transaction, trust and estates, divorce law. I didn't like most of those things, particularly very business law and tax law, secured transactions, things of that nature. Some people love it. It really wasn't for me. But I had to learn all this in order to pass the bar. And any attorney going to any state has to learn the particularities of that state's law in order to pass the bar. So keep that in mind. Most people end up practicing law often in the area where they go to law school because that's the area where they have contacts, and often the area where they've learned that particular state's law. For instance, I was going to perhaps go to the University of Virginia Law School, uh, and in which case I probably would have stayed down in Virginia or been an attorney in Charlottesville or Washington or Richmond or someplace in Virginia. uh, Going to the law school in upstate New York. I actually had a job for a small law firm in Watkins Glen. You may have heard of that tiny town on the southern end of Lake Seneca. Ithaca's on the southern end of Lake Cayuga. A beautiful little town, and Watkins Glen is famous for its Le Mans style race course and car racing, which is up on the hill outside the town. And the attorney I worked with, which was a wonderful general practice guy, he was also president of the race course, and part of my job as a lawyer was to go up and take tickets at the Le Mans race course, and I get to see a lot of European race teams and Ferraris and Lamborghinis, and so it was fascinating. I didn't learn much about law, but I really enjoyed that. I also got to do a number of general practice things, some trusts, some estates, some divorces, things of that nature, and what I learned about that was that I didn't like it. It really wasn't for me. Many people focus on things such as real estate. Anytime you buy and sell a house, as you will learn if you don't know already, you're going to have a lawyer involved in terms of looking, researching the title, helping with the closing, and so forth. Mm. Business law, setting up businesses, transactions, contracts, huge area. Corporate law, environmental law, admiralty law. There's a fascinating area. Uh, so believe me, there's a lot for anybody in law, and I would encourage any of you that are interested to think about that kind of thing. But for me, trial law was where I wanted to go. And what really brought me, again, I'd gone to undergraduate school in New Hampshire, and I liked New England a lot, was when I heard that the Attorney General's office had its own criminal division doing its own homicide. Well, I was naturally drawn to that area, which I'm so glad I did because I ended up back in New Hampshire. So there it was. I got my job in Congress, Attorney General's office. I had to take the course, and which was very rigorous, and the pressure is really on you, even though you've passed the law school and you think you're doing well. If you don't end up passing that 2 day intensive examination, you're going to lose your job, or you're going to be put back as an intern until you can pass the bar. In most states, you can only take the bar you only have so many times you're allowed to take the bar and not pass, and then you can't do it anymore. One of the interesting movies we're going to see down the road in class here is My Cousin Vinny. One of the funniest treatments of outlaw there is, but it's actually very interesting because there's a lot in My Cousin Vinny. As funny as it is, is actually very instructive about the law. One of the things, Bart, if you remember, My Cousin Vinny there, he supposedly took the bar 6 times before he passed. And in reality, in most states, you can't do that. After 3 times, you got to go to another state. Now, also, what happens if you want to practice in another state? Well, you have to either pass the bar in the other state in which you're practicing, or some states allow you to waive in, it's called, if you have a certain amount of experience and enough attorneys will support you. Some states will allow you to become a member of their bar if you can show that you've had a vast amount of experience and you would be able to pass it if you did take the bar. Others would still require you to take it. So the reality is many law students right out of law school will take several states' bars. In New England, often people will take New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, all within a week to just make sure they can pass one of them or more of them and then get jobs in various places. Again, I like New Hampshire. I certainly didn't want to take that bar again, and I certainly wouldn't want to take it again now because even though I've been an attorney for over 45 years, and I certainly I believe I know a lot about criminal law. Maybe I've forgotten so much about all those other areas that I'd have to take the course all over, and I certainly wouldn't want to try to pass that again. Anyway, you pass the bar, and when you do, it's what a relief. And now you've got your job as a young attorney. Either you're an associate in a law firm, you could be out in solo practice, which is always difficult to get started. You usually want to you learn a lot from experienced attorneys. I was a very young, inexperienced prosecutor attorney general's office, and our criminal division was so small back then. There was only 5 or 6 attorneys for the whole state. So anytime there'd be a homicide, you would go out to the scene. I would usually be the younger, inexperienced attorney with a more experienced attorney, learning the ropes basically. And as you may see in some movies and so forth, the police delight if you get, unfortunately, a particularly gruesome scene of violent crime and perhaps a dead body. Uh, they love to take the new person like me or the young guy person, the young attorney, or the young recruit, he or she, whoever, to the scene and sort of introduce them to a really pretty horrible scene. If you've ever been to an area where there's real violence, it's not like TV. And believe me, the seeing this happen and the smells and sort of everything that goes along with it, it's not a fun experience. And a lot of people have trouble with it, and as you'll see, you can get sick easily. Just which they it's almost like a hazing thing. They expect a young attorney to do. But luckily I grew up on a farm, so seen enough of the things in life, and I was able to handle this pretty well. And I was actually fairly fascinated because then also in New Hampshire, part of any homicide case is proving the cause of death. That's one of the key factors. You have to prove that the death was causally occurred because of some action of the defendant. And believe me, it's not as easy as it sounds. Often there's be a dead body, and it's because they've been there a long time, or they're deteriorated, or they've been in the water, or time has passed. You can't really tell what happened initially. You can't. Are they strangled? Are they beaten? Are they? For instance, there's a great misnomer about stab wounds and shooting wounds and so forth. They don't look really easy to pick out. Some shooting wounds look very like narrow and thin, not round like they show you in the movies. It's totally a misnomer. So often trying to determine the cause of death is difficult. And so they always have autopsy. You'll see, well, the cause of death is being held up until the autopsy determines. In New Hampshire, back in the 70s, again, we had so few homicides, we didn't have a official medical examiner. That's a forensic medical examiner, somebody that deals with death caused by violent means. So New Hampshire basically relied on medical pathologists. And what I mean, most hospitals have a pathologist that deal with people that have passed away in the hospital for some reason, usually a natural cause, a heart attack or a stroke or cancer or some other natural reason. They're not dealing with strangulations or poisonings or shootings or stabbings. It's sort of a specialty. Well, New Hampshire, we didn't have enough homicides for a forensic specialist, and we would often rely on hospital pathologists who were doing even the best they could, just didn't have the experience to, like, for instance, in every movie they show up and they say, oh, been dead 2 hours or 3 hours or between 7 and death occurred between 7 a.m. and 9 a.m. Well, no, it doesn't. It doesn't really work that way. It's very difficult to determine exact time of death. They have much better ways of doing that now, but back then, again, in the 70s, 80s, without a forensic specialist, it was often very difficult to get that causation. And sometimes we would have to call in an expert medical examiner from out of state. In New Hampshire, we relied on a doctor down in Massachusetts who was their medical examiner. They're big enough, obviously, to have a full medical examiner office. A guy named Katzis. I always remember him coming in on our most difficult homicide cases, and go. We would go to the autopsy and actually watch the doctor do this and ask questions, and then have the doctor try to explain what was the cause of death. And one of the reasons we did this is that so that when and if the case came to court down the road, you had been at the scene, you had gone to the autopsy. As a prosecutor, you weren't just reading this in a report months later. You had been there, you had seen it, you had observed the whole condition, you saw the witnesses, uh, you saw the trauma to the victim, whatever the trauma was, and it really stays with you and enables you as a prosecutor to describe this and tell the story of the case in a much better fashion. Now, one thing I do want to tell you, just to give you, again, highlight it a little bit into our criminal justice system and how things work in Keene, is a little explanation of, well, what brought me to Keene after the Attorney General's office. Well, I was in the Attorney General's office, and we did have a couple very unusual murder cases in the Keene area when I was in the Attorney General's office. It brought me back to this beautiful, idyllic little town with a wide main street and the white church and the nice college that I had driven through. And one of the first cases that I will tell you about is one of our earlier famous cases. It was State versus a guy named Frank Torres, an interesting case. I still recall it because it was March. I believe this is, if I recall right, it was 1978, March of 78. It was springtime. The snow was mostly melted, but there were still large piles of snow, old, dirtier snow along the roads that the plows had kicked up and in the woods. But things were melting in most of the areas. It was our mud season. I was at Concord, and we got a call that somebody had found a body off Route 12 in Charlestown, as you may know of Charlestown, north of Keene, up along the Connecticut River, north of North Walpole, if you've ever been up in that area. And the story was that there was a couple going along Route 12 looking for bottles and cans because Vermont has a return policy, and you can turn your bottles and cans in for money in Vermont, but New Hampshire, for whatever reason, we still don't have that. They're walking along the road looking for these bottles and cans that they're going to turn back in over in Dulles Falls. And there's a large snowbank in one of these pull-offs off Route 12, and sticking out of the snowbank, there it looks like is a pair of Converse, uh, the famous sneaker, which we all used to wear in the 60s and 70s, and I know it's still popular today in various colors and sort of the Chuck Taylors, the Converse. And at first, it looked like somebody had thrown these shoes out, and these people were thinking, "Oh my gosh, look at these shoes! Maybe we can take them back and clean them up or whatever." And they reached down to grab the shoes. Guess what? Yeah, you guessed it. There was still legs attached to these shoes. That's right. And it turned out there was a frozen body in the snowbank off Route 12. And of course, these people were horrified. The they There was no cell phones at that time. One of them flagged down a car, drove them back down to North Walpole. They got on a payphone. Your parents may remember the payphones. I still do, driving around looking for a place to pay to make a phone call. And they called that they had found what appeared to be a body. So from it's right on the border. Both Vermont and New Hampshire authorities responded. Our state police responded, and we got the call to the Attorney General's office. So I'm, excuse me, I'm again a young attorney with a more senior guy. We run out to Route 12, and they had taken the snow away by the time we got there. And sure enough, it was a dead body. They hadn't removed the body yet, but there was something very unusual about this body. And guess what that was? There was no head or hands on this body. As gruesome as that is, this was the reality. And the body was frozen. It had obviously been there since it had been buried in this snowbank for some time. We had no idea how long. And of course, it turns out it had been there probably almost 4 months once we really determined this. But we got this body, and they took it in an ambulance back to Cheshire Medical down in their pathology area. And again, we didn't have a medical examiner, but I mean, clearly they got the body out. Clearly, this is a dead guy, a male, but there was no reason that could be seen as to what caused the death. Of course, obviously, didn't have a head or hands. The cause of death may obviously have been related to that. Uh, the scene was carefully examined by state police. And again, we didn't have, unlike you see, I know you've seen this TV show CSI, where the crime lab people they're all movie stars. They all rush out and they have guns and they get right to the crime scene as soon as it happens. No, it doesn't like that at all. New Hampshire, Vermont, and most of Maine. When a crime scene happens, there's no central CSI people that run out. It's usually up to the local detectives or even the patrolmen to look at the scene, search the scene using the knowledge they have to save and preserve the evidence that's there. And in this case, the state police detectives had some really good training, and they had to look at the scene, and they did find a couple things of very useful later on. They found a couple of teeth, which they didn't know were necessarily associated with the body, but they took the teeth in case we could correlate the teeth to the body, and it turned out that was very important later on. You may also understand that even though there was some frozen blood at the scene, which was obvious had occurred at some point, when they were taking the body there, or there was no determination there whether that somebody had removed the head and the hands at the scene or somewhere else. But the blood was frozen. In those days, it was our ability to examine blood and determine what kind of blood it was very basic. We didn't have DNA testing in the late 70s. We could determine first whether blood was human or animal, and it was determined this was human. Uh, but then we could sometimes get the various types, O, A, B, and so forth. And that's about as close as we could get. So it was determined this was human blood. It was probably his, but we couldn't. The blood had been there so long, we couldn't even determine a type. So we had this body. We didn't know how the person was killed. And so, again, this is pre internet. The Attorney General's office, working with local authorities, put out notices in all the local papers that this body had been found. It was in the local TV and Boston News. And we put out descriptions of the clothing found on the body. The body had clothing. About the size. It wasn't much you could say. The medium sized male, maybe 5'7" to 5'9", in that range. They described the clothing. They put out notices saying, if people have been missing somebody, if somebody had run away, they haven't heard from somebody that sounds like this. Well, again, we got all sorts of responses during the next several weeks. And it took that long in those days. It wasn't internet. You couldn't just email or put this up on Facebook. There was no such thing. And again, this is less than only 40 years ago or so. So this is how things have changed so quickly. But we did get a number of responses which were of interest that could have been called. Many of them were just way off. couldn't possibly be the person we had. But we had a couple of really interesting responses, which one of them actually proved to be the one we were looking for, but we didn't know that at the time. And what the crime lab people did in Congress is they took the clothing from the body, they'd done the autopsy and so on, and they had the clothing out on these tables, and people that had contacted us that had apparently a description or a loss of a loved one, a brother, a husband, a boyfriend, somebody who went missing in the month or months before this that seemed to be close and might have matched the description. We actually had them come to Concord and be interviewed as to what the circumstances were, what this person looked like that they were missing, when they were missing, and to take a look at the clothing. Well, uh, we went through probably five or six of people that well, they couldn't identify the clothing. There was a couple that were close maybe, but nothing was ringing a bell. And then suddenly this, I still recall, I was up at the lab. This one woman came in. She went over to the table and looked down and took a look at the shoes and the pants and just started crying. Fell to her knees. She said, I know that she described how she'd purchased the pants at a Walmart and the shoes she bought for her boyfriend at a some one of the local Keene stores. Uh, Started talking about her boyfriend was a guy named Rich Maxon that had disappeared just before Christmas of the previous year. And we then started to search out Richard Maxon. He had was a local guy, didn't have a lot of family, had lived in Keene for a number of years, and oh, sure enough, guess what? Well, we tried to track down local dentists to see if we could connect the teeth, for instance. And sure enough, now again, remember in those days, they don't have digital records. They don't have all the X-rays and so on. Dentists actually had little cards, and they did diagrams of teeth and so forth on there, which they kept in their records at that time. And we found a dentist that the Richard Maxon, who had disappeared, used to go to. We took the teeth to the dentist, and guess what? Bingo. It was the teeth. Yes. The dentist positively identified the several teeth that we had as coming from Richard Maxon. And then we kept investigating, and the detective started digging who his friends were, who he hung out with. He was a local guy. Used to play. He was a unmarried. Played at some of our local bars. Was a known guitar guy, free spirit. So when he disappeared, I mean, people paid attention, but he didn't have a lot of close friends. His girlfriend thought he just took off and headed to California or something, but it turned out he did. Uh, so as we uh, investigated this, more and more people pointed us toward a gathering, a social party, which occurred in a home in Marlboro, an apartment in Marlboro, New Hampshire, uh, in December, at which Richard Maxon was, in which something apparently horrible had happened, and nobody wanted to talk about it. Everybody was frightened, and we kept investigating this, and it was determined through a long investigation that the death was caused by a local guy named Frank Torres, who had actually shot Mr. Maxon at the party. Uh, they apparently, through the witnesses who we later developed, who were again frightened to come forward at first, it took a while to develop. But it turned out that this had happened at the party, and they had sort of panicked, put the body in a car, and took it to North Walpole and dumped it off the side of the road. And then later, in the next day or so, determined uh, after they thought about it, or Mr. Torres thought about it, determined well they were going to be able to identify this body really easily. So they actually turned out they went back, cut the head and the hands off the body, as gruesome as that is, so it wouldn't be easily identified. And apparently, supposedly got rid of the head and hands in the East River down in New York. At any rate, we were able to put enough evidence together to actually go forward with a prosecution. And I remember coming to Keene and being part of that case, which ended up in a plea negotiation. Um, there were strengths or weaknesses in the cases we've indicated, and of course, strengths or weaknesses in the defense, and both sides had to evaluate what their case was, and it ended up being a plea agreement in which Mr. Torres pled guilty to a slightly lower level of type of murder, I believe second degree at that time. And then that case was, I think, appealed later on questions of knowing or intelligent waiver of his of rights during the appellate thing. But that was one of the first cases that brought me to New Hampshire, and it gives you an idea of how far we've come in terms of being able to evaluate particularly physical evidence. Have we been able, if we lived in a digital era like we are now, we'd have cell phone evidence, we'd have DNA, we'd have a lot greater ability, but we were able to put that case together way back. Well, that brought me to Keene, really to be part of the prosecution, which took place right at the Cheshire County Superior Court, which is still there. And I just remember really liking Keene so much and enjoying this area. And after a few more years in the Attorney General's office, many people at that time would then transfer into private practice. And I decided to do that as well. uh, Thinking, well, you only go so far in prosecution. Especially at that time, there wasn't a real career prosecutor. You got to a certain point, and if you really wanted to advance, you really needed to get into private practice. And I decided, well, yeah, I had met a couple of attorneys here in the Keene area when I was doing that case, then another case we'll talk about next time. And so I got to like this attorney. They liked me. I ended up interviewing in a job over here, and I came to Keene and moved here in 1980. And I've been here ever since. So as you can see, and guess what? I met my wife, who turned out to have gone to Keene State College from New York City area, and she became a teacher in a local elementary school. And I met her, and here we are, still in Keene all these years later. I later, after being in private practice for a number of years, uh, decided to run for our local district attorney, the DA. As we talked about in New Hampshire, the district attorney is not called the DA. You won't hear that term in New Hampshire, and many states don't always call it the DA, although that's the popular term on TV and media. In New Hampshire, it's the county attorney. If you want to be the DA, if you want to be the chief prosecutor in New Hampshire, you have to run for county attorney. And one of the things I would just focus on, as we talked about, is the political process. The district attorney, or in this case, the county attorney, has to run and become part of the political process, which is can be difficult, particularly as you can see how uh, uh, just challenging politics is at this stage, and it always has been, but maybe never as difficult as it is now. Uh, but a prosecutor doesn't really generally isn't running on being conservative or liberal or whatever. You're running on trying to do a good job of being experienced, being fair, of enforcing the law, and doing your best to come up with various sentencing alternatives. And often prosecutors run on they have different attitudes about sentencing and how cases should be sentenced, and which really sets the tone for their office. And then prosecutors then hire assistants that are not elected. So after a number of years here in Keene, uh, I got to know a lot of the police, and again, I liked the town so much. I thought I could have an impact by perhaps running to be the county attorney, which I did, and actually won that and became county attorney for the next 12 years. Uh, and I really enjoyed that. I had a good staff, and each prosecutor had really a focus of different types of crime that they would or had a talent for investigate. Sometimes it was for financial crime. Many people specialized in child victim crime, uh, assaultive crime, and again, my main concern has always been violent crime, whether domestic violence still a huge problem in our criminal justice system, violence against the most vulnerable, such as the elderly, or children were the most challenging crime to prosecute from a criminal point of view. And we'll get into talk about that. Um, Let me again just review with you now that you know why I'm here and how I got to uh, Keene, New Hampshire. And, I hope you enjoy your time here in Keene. If you don't come from this area, I think you will find that it's a terrific place to live and a great college as well, which is one of the reasons I started teaching at Keene State many years ago. So I could introduce people to the criminal justice system and why I like it and appreciate it so much. Uh, One of the things I will tell you or highlight for you, we talked about some of the major principles of the criminal justice system, such as the rule of law, which means obviously no one is above the law. We see this all the time in the current system where we see political people being prosecuted for things that have occurred. Uh, we see people, former coaches just got charged over on the seacoast for doing something sexually wrong, inappropriate, uh, and people in power and so on. So the idea is that although it doesn't work perfectly, that the law applies to everybody, from the former president of the United States all the way down to every citizen. And that is the rule of law. We've talked about how our criminal justice system, there is substantive law and procedural law. And we're going to be looking at both of those in in this course. In law school, those are very lengthy subjects. They actually require separate courses. Criminal law often has two separate courses just for criminal law, the substantive law, which means the law of crime. What is crime? We know homicide is a crime. We know burglary is a crime. But things change all the time. For instance, we now have all sorts of computer crime. There was never such a crime as ID theft 20 years ago. Uh, with the advent of the internet and the use of cards and so forth, ID theft, credit card theft, uh, theft on the internet, and so forth, scams have become a much larger part of the criminal justice system. When I became early in my prosecution, the biggest financial crime, to show you how quickly things change in 20, 30 years, the biggest financial crime was passing bad checks. That was a crime. Passing bad checks. People would forge a check or they would steal somebody's check, write it out as if it was theirs, or forge the signature, or cash a check on an account with no money. That was called passing bad checks. Well, of course, fewer and fewer people use checks today, and passing bad checks is a very seldom investigated or reported crime. However, stealing PIN numbers, stealing credit card and debit card theft is huge. Didn't even exist before. ID theft is huge. Using computers for inappropriate reasons is now a huge area of crime. Uh, and the legislature have had to create or react to what's happening and create crimes that didn't exist before. For instance, there's a crime what that we talked about at some point where uh, sexual predators will use the internet to get access to younger people and lure them for inappropriate sexual contact, which would be illegal, obviously, if they were doing it on a personal basis, but they're not. They're connecting with people on websites and chat rooms. They're pretending to be something that they're not, and they're luring uh, young people, usually under the age of consent, to do things inappropriately on the internet. Well, we didn't really have a lot of laws that covered any of that, and our legislature, as most states have tried to adapt to this, have created a law called uh, improper use of computer services or illegal use of computer services, which is what the heck is that? Well, that means using a computer to do something the wrong way in terms of approaching somebody from an improper sexual standpoint. Uh, and uh, illegal computer services is now one of our biggest major crimes. In terms of luring, for instance, child pornography, another crime for which was much of a smaller, more isolated crime in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, simply because it was very hard to take and disseminate these horrible abuses of children, or photographic or video abuses of children that couldn't be exchanged and so on. Now, again, with the internet, you can have access to kids. You can get them to send you improper pictures right on the internet, or you can abuse a child you may have a connection to and put those pictures on the internet, which can be, of course, spread and shared and so on, nationally, internationally, and so on. And these are type of crimes that never existed before. So the legislature has had to try to adapt to the changing technology and to define crimes as things have changed. Uh, you might imagine one of our biggest sea changes in crimes was the advent of the motor vehicle. Until the turn of the 19th century, when most people were riding horses and wagons and so forth. For instance, you could you realize take a look at some of the pictures of Keene back before motor vehicles. I mean, I know this sounds ancient, but really the 1800s were not that long ago. Guess what? Well, you could ride a horse, or you could take your wagon down any road on any side you wanted to. Come to an intersection, and you took your wagon this way and you waited, and there was no stoplights or stop signs, folks. There wasn't anything like lines in the road, keep to the right. You had your horse, you went where you wanted to go. You had your wagon. Uh, when motor vehicles started, again, it created a revolution in our country, both good and bad, and for all the good and the bad things that have gone on, obviously mostly good for people. There's been a love affair with the motor vehicle, but we quickly decided or saw that motor vehicles, as great as they were and giving you freedom and the ability to go places, they're also extremely dangerous. People started getting hurt right away. The faster these vehicles went, the more people could get injured and so on. So our legislature had to respond with creating rules and regulations. There's a huge mass of rules and regulations surrounding motor vehicles that people have to comply with. And these rules and regulations, as you may have learned in your introduction to the criminal law, there are some crimes that are just bad by nature, have been considered evil and bad for almost the beginning of civilized society. Again, murder, rape, robbery, theft, basic crimes which are and almost have always been considered criminal. They may be defined slightly differently in different societies and so on, but they've always been criminal. Uh, those are called mala in se crimes. I mean, you've heard that term, mala in se, bad in of themselves. Then there's other kinds of crimes called mala prohibita. Well, mala prohibita, again, is a fancy term which just means it's prohibited because our legislature says it's prohibited. There's no specific reason necessarily why it should be criminal. For instance, most of our drug laws are what we consider prohibited. We're seeing a revolution, as we've talked about, in our particularly drug possession laws, sweeping the country, changing from the old outdated concept of the war on drugs, which was, again, total failures we talked about, to most of the states are trying to think about legalizing lower level drug possession, such as marijuana, uh, and coming up with more of administrative controls on how things are sold or handled and so forth. Uh, uh, but maintaining the criminality of certain high level drugs, like which are so dangerous, such as meth, or now fentanyl, as you know, is our big danger. Over the years, we've had cocaine be a huge problem, heroin was a huge problem. Now it's fentanyl. No, again though, how we handle those and how we get to the real drug dealers is another time we're going to be talking about that, but it's still a real challenge. Uh, Motor vehicle laws are, though, sort of like drug laws in that they are mala prohibita. We decided, well, vehicles have to stay to one side of the road or the other. There's no particular reason why you have to drive on the right. Doesn't mean driving on the left is wrong, but it means it's illegal because we don't want you driving on the left because you're going to hit somebody else. Now, we had to come up with as you know, some countries do it differently, like England. You drive on the left. If you go to England or Scotland, Australia, I remember arriving in London and renting a car. and of course the steering wheel's on the other side, the shifter's on you, and wow. And you want to talk about confusion? It's one thing to drive on that side, and then you get into a roundabout. Whoa! Well, uh, the point is, there's no specific reason why you have to do these things, except they had to come up with a structure so that people could be safe, and so we could have rules and regulations, so people wouldn't crash into each other, and you wouldn't run over pedestrians and so forth. So we created a whole uh, motor vehicle laws and administrative rules, and we not only had to control behavior on the roads, but just the way well safety features on vehicles, the way vehicles are built, the type of lights that you need to display at night and so forth. And again, the legislature created where you have to have certain lights and you have to have time to turn signal. And well, again, all this was adapted to the changes in technology. And we're going to keep seeing that, folks, as we know electric vehicles are now becoming more and more of a thing. For instance, right now, I'll tell you a fascinating change. Uh, Certain small motorcycle type vehicles are all regulated for this in the same way that cars are. You know, a motorcycle, you have to get a license. You have to have certain safety features on it, uh, and you have to operate it in a certain way, very much like a motor vehicle. And there's smaller motorcycles like scooters, and but there's certain things where if you get so low in power and so slow that we decided we're not going to regulate some of these things. Uh, Although now we're changing our minds on it. Things like golf carts or the little electric scooters that people use. A lot of cities are dealing with the little the hand scooters. You go along and you do the scooter leg, but they got little motors in them, so they're going really fast. Now the real challenge is, guess what? What's coming in the last few years? Electric bikes, cycles. That's right, not motorcycles, but bicycles that have little electric motors. Guess what? They're great. They're the coming thing as bicycles. And you know, bicycles aren't regulated in terms of lights and oil. Although if you're out on the roads, certainly you want to have some sort of lights on to show yourself to motorists. And in some states, obviously, you have bike lanes and things of that nature. But now we're dealing with the challenge. Well, what happens when you put an electric motor in a bicycle? Now, the early electric motors didn't make the bicycles go that fast, but now you some of these bicycles can go 25, 30, 35 miles an hour. And so and there's no regulation. Well, there's going to be that they're dealing with that. And that's going to be coming up because it turns out they go just as fast and can be just as dangerous and hurt somebody just as much as motor vehicles can. So that's just again a good example of how changes in technology uh, change laws. For instance, your cell phone, right? You all know again, 25, 30 years ago, we were just cell phones were just beginning. Uh, you couldn't you couldn't stalk anybody with your cell phone. You couldn't blow them up with emails because you couldn't email anybody with your cell phone. Now your cell phone's a little computer. So guess how you want to stalk somebody, if you want to threaten somebody, if you want to let somebody know that you're upset with them and you want to cause problems, well, you can do that on your cell phone. And a lot of this stuff now is illegal. Also, guess what? If you're selling drugs or you're making arrangements before or after a crime, what often are you doing? You're working it on your cell phone. You're texting. You're going on social media. So uh, they've had to adjust this, and a lot of the crimes now have been defined in terms of cell phone use. And police have to investigate these crimes, investigate cell phones, and looking at things like cell phones and computers have become a whole specialty in the forensics of criminal law because that's what we need to search now. Nobody's writing letters. In the old days, we used to have things called a wiretap. I know you've heard that. You've seen this on the movies where they would get a warrant to tap into your hard phone line and they'd sit in some other apartment with a little recording going and they'd listen to your phone calls. It could be organized crime or a drug organization or some other uh, illegal activity that the law enforcement had gotten a search warrant for. That was called a wiretap. Nowadays, nobody uses they don't have many wiretap applications now. You want to search somebody's text messages, their email, their Facebook, their Instagram, all these different ways, TikTok, whatever. That kind of exchange of information is going to be on the cell phone, and that's the way the police now look to get that done. All that is an example of substantive law changes, how you define crime, the elements of these crimes, and how you have to change. The legislature has to continually adapt to that kind of substantive change uh, with the changes in technology and society and so forth. That's substantive law, and that's half of what our course is looking at. The other portion of the law we're going to be again focusing on is the procedure. That's the process, due process. That's what's guaranteed by our Constitution. And what does due process mean? That's the process, the procedure, how we're going to make a determination that somebody has violated one of those rules we have created in the substantive law, one of those laws, one of those things that we've decided is so serious that it's going to be criminal. We have to come up with a procedure that is constitutional to get us from A to the end where we've determined that there's enough proof and there's somebody's found guilty and they're going to be sentenced. They're going to have go through an appeal and have the right to take a look at all that. That is procedural law. And again, in law school, it's a whole separate course. We're going to be taking a real close look at that as we go down the line, and we're going to begin that tonight. As a matter of fact, that's some of the things I will focus on. Uh, uh, we talked last time, and I would just emphasize this and review this again. How in the substantive law, crimes are classified. If you recall the statute we looked at last time, it's up on Canvas, and I gave it to you in hard copy as well. That's 625.9 in the New Hampshire RSAs. That's the classification of crimes. And just to review, this is very important that you understand. Our criminal law is all crimes basically come into three major boxes or classifications. And you really need to have a basic understanding of those three boxes. We've looked at those last time. Let me just review. The least serious of things that are handled in the criminal justice system, but are really not considered crimes, are what's called violations. All right. A violation is something that occurs that we think is important enough that to make a determination on it, we want to go through the criminal procedure and the process. You want to have a right to a hearing. You want to have a right to dispute it. You want the state to have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, again, remember that goes back to one of our classic basic principles in criminal law, which is the presumption of innocence, meaning the state has the burden of proof from the beginning to the end. As we highlighted for you before, no one has to prove they're not guilty or innocent. You don't have to prove anything. The burden is on the state. Now you're allowed to try to show this, but if it's up to the state to prove that you are guilty. And if the state can't meet its burden, then you're going to be found to be not guilty. Remember, it's not innocent. You're going to be found to be not guilty. Now you may be innocent. Our system has various protections, filters, etc., which we'll highlight to try to assure that they do as good a job as we possibly can to making sure that only the people who are guilty get to the very end of the system. But it isn't a perfect system. Never has been. There are still people that are not guilty or innocent to get through the system, and you sometimes will hear about these because we do have processes to, if it is determined that a mistake is made, turn around and fix that and change that outcome. The Innocence Project is a great organization that focuses on trying to demonstrate or prove when there's been a miscarriage of justice, and they do a great job at that. We're very fortunate that it really doesn't happen very often, and we're lucky about that because people try very hard. But it has happened, and we're lucky to have organizations like that that work to create and fix those problems. But let's get back to the classification. So some things, even though they're going to be handled on a through the criminal procedure or the process. That is, you have to, the state, if they're going to charge you with something, you still have to prove the case. We consider that they're so minimal or so low level behavior that we're not going to classify somebody who that is convicted of this as a criminal. And what really that means is you're not going to subject anyone to loss of their personal freedom, which is incarceration. Being subject to incarceration is that key distinction between non-criminal and criminal. So if you're charged with a violation, a great example we talked about is a speeding ticket, your classic violation level offense. Uh, you could have there's plenty of other minor offenses. First offense uh, type of low level drug possession. Uh, uh, Open container of beer in Keene, as we talked about, violates the Keene ordinance, which is a violation level offense. If you have a loud party, it could violate the noise ordinance, or you have a loud muffler or no muffler, you can be charged with a violation of the noise thing, our ordinance in Keene. That doesn't mean, and if you're convicted of that, you're not going to go to jail. You're not going to be subject to jail or incarceration. You could be fined. You could lose your license. We talked about. Remember, a license is a privilege granted by the state, can be taken away by the state uh, without being convicted of a crime. But you could be convicted of a violation, and in many of these lower level offenses, it's often first time nonviolent offenses. Sometimes uh, cases like this are sent outside the criminal justice system, where somebody is really not convicted on the condition they do things. Maybe it's community service, maybe it's get counseling for drug or mental substance abuse or mental health issues. That's called diversion. Many times you'll get a sentence, you get a fine or a loss of license, and they can be held in abeyance or suspended on the condition again that you do things. Uh, the criminal justice system really bends over backwards to try to figure out what assistance you need to change the behavior that you have. And believe me, it's a huge challenge. We still nobody's got the right answer for all the cases, but we do know that many people need help with either substance abuse or mental health issues. And often that's one of the conditions of either a low sentence on a violation or a being diverted to the non-criminal system. So again, those are violations. The next level up, which is the first level of crime right, is the misdemeanor. Again, that term comes from our English common law, crimes and felonies, misdemeanors. Those are the two levels of crimes. Misdemeanors are the lower level of crimes. They are crimes for which the incarceration, if you recall this, we mentioned this, the maximum is 1 year of incarceration. That doesn't mean you do a year, but it means you could do a year. Often a sentence will be suspended on the condition you do community service, or you go to counseling, or you follow through with or you stay away from somebody you've been bothering or threatening. All these are conditions that they hold the sentence in suspended. And then if you do that, continue to do that behavior, or you fail to get the counseling or the community service, then the suspended sentence can be brought forward. You can actually be incarcerated. Again, well, also when your incarceration is less than 1 year, we've talked about you're going to be incarcerated at the house of correction, not the big house, not the prison, the local house of correction. Every jurisdiction has sort of a different arrangement for their local houses of correction. New Hampshire, we luckily most of our houses of correction are really good. They do a great job. In Cheshire County, we're very fortunate. We have terrific house of correction with a great staff. They're in the forefront of change and doing things in the most positive way possible. They really care about the people and they're trying to make a difference. So, and you can imagine the challenges if you're in the house correction system, particularly when people have often very short sentences, which may seem like a long time if you're doing them. 30 days, 60 days, 90 days are classic sort of sentences at the house of correction. But as you can imagine, what difference can you make in somebody's life in 30 days or 60 days, 90 days, even a few months? Uh, Sometimes not a lot, but what you can do is get people out again on the condition they address the needs they have. When people get out early, which almost everybody does in house correction, they are called on probation, and they're being supervised by the Department of Probation. Uh, and again, the each state and the federal people have their own Department of Corrections that has probation and parole, which are people that supervise you while you're in the community. Very crucial part of our criminal justice system, which we'll focus on when we get to corrections. Often very underfunded, underappreciated, with huge files and huge caseloads, and yet they're so important. And if we intend to make a difference, if we intend to have the criminal justice system have an impact and help people break out of the behaviors they're in or whatever. So that's probation. Now, uh, the next break point for crimes is felonies. They are the most serious offenses, and again, those are the offenses for which the penalty is more than 1 year. And believe me, these are can be your most serious level offenses. There's Class A and Class B felonies. Class B felonies are lower level. Your maximum sentence is 7.5, as we pointed out. In New Hampshire, again, every state does it a little different. Class A felony, the maximum penalty is 15 years. One of the things I would point out to you that we didn't talk about is when you go on a state prison sentence, on a felony sentence, you have every sentence has a minimum and a maximum. House correction sentence, the lower level, that's below 1 year, only has one sentence. You'll get a 30-day sentence, 60 days. You'll get 6 months, 9 months, up to a year, no more than that. But remember, even though you get the one sentence, let's say you get a year, you're always eligible to be placed on probation to be released by the administrator of the House of Correction, basically within 2/3 of your sentence. So obviously, if you have a year sentence, 2/3 is what, 8 months, right? You could be released. If you have a 3 month sentence, right, 2/3 is 2 months, and you could actually be released earlier than that for things like uh, work release. You get a job, as I said. If you're in the house correction, you can get out during the day, go to work, come back. Maybe not pleasant, but you continue to work, you continue to earn a living, you may be able to support your family, etc. That's called work release. So that's what house corrections are. In prison sentences, felony sentences, which are not a term of generally years, you're going to get a minimum and a maximum. A minimum and a maximum. Every sentence in felonies has a minimum and a maximum. And this will get you now. Here's funny. You don't have to really remember this exactly, but I want you to understand. The minimum in New Hampshire can be no more than one half the maximum. So you can't get a sentence of 7 to 8 years, a minimum of seven, maximum of eight. No, because 7 is more than a half. You could get a sentence of 4 to 8. That's an okay sentence. You could get 3 to 8. That's less than a half. 2 to 8, 1 to 8, right? And why is that key? Well, the key is the minimum sentence sets the time for when you're eligible for parole. Remember, when you get out early from the house correction, it's called probation. When you get out early from state prison on a felony sentence, it's called parole. Uh, and basically, the same people are supervising parole and probation officers are usually the same officers in most states. The big difference is when you're in a state prison setting, in order to get on parole, you go before a parole board. You have to show to the board that you have qualified for parole. In a house correction, the administrator makes the decision, the head of the house correction. There's no board. In state prison, you have the parole board, and they'll make a decision. Again, you'll often hear about parole hearings, people subject to parole coming up for parole. Uh, some of our most heinous or famous criminals have come up for parole repetitively and were sometimes granted, sometimes denied. One of the most famous recent ones that might come to mind is uh, you've heard of Charles Manson, committed those horrible crimes in the Hollywood area in Los Angeles in the 70s. And he had his gang, the Manson gang, mostly females and some men. And they killed a number of celebrities in the 70s. And Manson went to prison for a period of time in life, but kept coming up for parole, as did many of his people that were on his gang. And again, the victims had a right to be informed of that under the victims' right law. And they would have these constant hearings every couple of years. And Manson was denied parole again and again. And he actually recently died in prison about a year ago, in case you didn't notice that one. But it's a good example of what happens in terms of prison and parole. The reality is most people, and in fact, everybody except first degree murderers who do not qualify for parole come up for parole at some point in state prison. But again, your sentence has to be a minimum and a maximum, and it's the minimum that sets your parole time. So you're eligible for just like the House of Correction, 2/3 of your minimum. So if you have a minimum of 3 to 6, 3 in minimum, 6 maximum, then you'd be eligible for parole in 2 years. So again, the newspapers, when somebody's sentenced, they always explain how many years you're subject to, but what they never really focus on is when you're really going to be eligible for release on parole. Uh, and it's going to be 2/3 of your minimum. And the only people with a sentence that does not have a minimum, at least in New Hampshire and most of the Northeast or New England states, is first degree murder has life without parole. Now, I know this is a lot we've looked at tonight. Again, I want you to think about the movie. We'll highlight that a little more in our next lecture. I will talk to you a little about some of the things just to think about that we're in injustice for all. We're not realistic at all. We're also next time, what I want to do is focus a little more on the procedural end of the process. So how do things get started? And what is the actual filters that occur? Why is it that our system usually ends up right, not in a trial, but in a plea bargain and or plea negotiation as a result? And how do we get to that point, and why is it so important in our criminal justice system? How do we get from A to B? We're going to focus on that in much greater detail next time, which will be the 20th. So I'm glad you folks are here, and I'm so glad you're in class and learning about the criminal justice system. Uh, Next week, we'll have another session up on Canvas. What I'd like you to do is just please continue in your text and get to finishing reading chapter 2. We'll discuss more of that next time, including the specifics of procedure. We're also going to talk a little about where our law comes from, which we know really is England or the English common law, except for what state? Don't forget, Louisiana is the only state that has a basis in a different law system, which is the French civil law, not the English common law. They're still they're still subject to our Constitution, though. We like Louisiana, but again, right? If you want to be an attorney in Louisiana, you better go to LSU, or you better decide you got to live Baton Rouge or New Orleans, or because it's a little different system. And it's so different that you would never pass the bar by going to a law school in a different state. Very difficult if you did, anyway. But keep that in mind. So I hope you've enjoyed this evening. I'm very glad to see you. We'll see you in a week, and you'll be able to click on Canvas and come up with our next session. Okay. Have a good evening, all, and we'll see you in a week. I'm just so glad to see you all. Bye bye now.